A human soldier made a wish that left the galaxy's most gorgeous alien princess pregnant. The twin sons of Zarathia cast their golden light across the shimmering spires of the alien capital, Lunathan, a city that seemed to rise straight out of a dream. The spires glittered with a strange bioluminescent material that pulsed faintly, as if the city itself were alive. The air smelled faintly of something floral, a scent Ethan Drake couldn't quite place. It was as though the atmosphere wanted to lull him into a sense of peace. Yet, as a soldier of the human elite, peace was a state he found hard to embrace. Ethan's boots clicked against the marble-like floor of the grand palace as he entered the audience chamber. The chamber was vast, its ceiling stretching high enough to house the famed Starfleet of Earth itself. Alien banners, adorned with intricate symbols and luminescent threads, hung from the walls. It was a place designed to remind visitors of the kingdom's wisdom and prosperity, a place where one could feel both awe and insignificance. At the far end of the room sat King Zarathan, a towering figure draped in flowing silks that shimmered like liquid silver. Despite his advanced age, his eyes held the sharpness of a man who had seen countless wars and lived to broker peace. His presence was regal, yet unassuming, commanding respect without demanding it. Captain Ethan Drake, Zarathan's voice rumbled, low and melodic, as though he were speaking not just to Ethan, but to the very walls around them. Earth has sent its finest. Ethan saluted sharply, his face an impassive mask. His training dictated discipline, though the strange surroundings and the overwhelming presence of the king unsettled him. "It is an honor to serve, Your Majesty. I will do everything in my power to ensure your safety." The king studied him for a moment, his glowing, deep violet eyes narrowing slightly. "Safety," Zarathan mused. "It is a fragile concept in a universe that thrives on chaos. Do you believe you can guard me against it, soldier?" "If it's chaos you face, sir," Ethan replied, his tone firm but not arrogant, "then I am exactly who you want by your side." Zarathan chuckled, a low sound that resonated through the chamber. Spoken like a true warrior, he waved a hand, a signal for Ethan to rise from his formal stance. "Come, meet my court. There are those who will look to test you." As Ethan stepped forward, he became acutely aware of the stares. Court officials, advisors, and nobles, their features a spectrum of alien elegance, observed him with expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. It was here, among the crowd, that Ethan first saw Princess Eudora. She stood slightly apart from the others, her luminous gown flowing like starlight around her tall, slender form. Her features were striking. Delicately sharp cheekbones, skin that seemed to hold a faint iridescence, and eyes the same violet hue as her father's, though hers held a sharper glint. Her posture was regal, her expression composed, yet there was something about the way her gaze lingered on Ethan. Curiosity, perhaps, or caution. Ethan's training took over, his expression betraying none of the surprise or intrigue he felt. He inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement of her presence. She returned the gesture with the barest nod, her face unreadable. Before Ethan could dwell further on her presence, the king rose from his throne, his towering frame casting a long shadow across the chamber. "Captain Drake, your first task begins now. Tonight, the Thericans will attempt to disrupt the peace we have long worked to maintain. I trust you've read the intelligence reports." Ethan nodded. The Thericans were a brutal race, known for their guerrilla tactics and unrelenting hunger for power. They had resisted every diplomatic effort Zarathan had extended and had escalated to direct threats against his life. "I have, Your Majesty." "Good." Zarathan's eyes gleamed with approval. "Then you know the stakes. If they succeed in harming me, they will strike at the heart of our stability. You must not let that happen." The evening fell over Lunathan, its twin moons casting a soft, ethereal glow over the palace. Hidden among the palace corridors, Ethan moved like a shadow. His combat suit blended seamlessly with the surroundings, its adaptive tech allowing him to remain virtually invisible. His pulse was steady, his senses heightened as he monitored every movement within the palace. The attack came not from the front gates, as expected, but through the sky lattice, a massive glass-like dome that protected the central chambers. A subtle hum was the only warning Ethan had before the lattice shattered in a spray of shards, followed by the roar of thrusters. A group of Therakin assassins descended from the sky, their sleek armor reflecting the moonlight. Ethan moved with precision. He activated his tactical visor, marking each target and calculating their positions. The first assassin landed on the floor, weapon raised, but Ethan was faster. A single shot from his pulse rifle dropped the chaos erupted. The palace guards, though skilled, were unprepared for the Therakin's ferocity. Ethan became the center of the battle, his movements a blur as he engaged the intruders. He used the palace's intricate architecture to his advantage, leaping between platforms and striking from unexpected angles. One of the assassins broke through the defenses, making a direct line for the king's chamber. Ethan's stomach tightened. He sprinted after the intruder, his boots skidding on the polished floor as he turned a corner. The assassin was seconds away from breaching the chamber when Ethan intercepted, tackling the alien to the ground. They grappled violently, Ethan's strength pitted against the assassin's superior size. The alien drew a blade, its edge gleaming with a strange energy, but Ethan disarmed it with a well-placed blow to the wrist. In one fluid motion, he drove his pulse rifle into the alien's chest and fired. The room fell silent. The last of the Therakins had been subdued. Ethan stood, his breath heavy, surveying the aftermath. The king's chamber doors opened, revealing Zarathan and Eudora. The princess's eyes widened as she took in the scene. Her guards injured, the invaders defeated, and Ethan, standing in the center of the chaos, a quiet storm of efficiency and resolve. "You've exceeded my expectations, Captain," Zarathan said, his voice steady but tinged with admiration. "You've proven that chaos may yet be tamed." Eudora stepped forward, her gaze locked on Ethan. For the first time, her composure seemed to falter, if only slightly. "You saved him," she said softly, her voice carrying an unspoken gratitude. "You saved us." Ethan met her eyes, his own reflecting a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "It's my duty, princess." "Nothing." But even as he spoke the words, he felt the faint stirrings of something more, something he wasn't ready to name. The night's silence was broken by the distant sound of the city's bells, ringing in both alarm and relief. Ethan holstered his weapon and straightened his stance, already preparing for whatever chaos the next day might bring. The palace gardens of Lunathan were a marvel, sprawling across acres of bioluminescent flora and alien architecture. The plants glowed softly in shades of blue, green, and violet, casting ethereal patterns on the marble pathways. Streams of silvery water wound between the garden beds, their surfaces reflecting the twin moons that hung lazily in the sky. Ethan Drake had seen countless wonders in his years of service, but nothing quite like this. He walked the perimeter with practiced precision, his tactical visor scanning for any anomalies. Though the Therakin attack had been thwarted, the threat was far from over. His steps were measured, his focus unwavering, but the serenity of the garden began to pull at his tightly wound nerves. The silence here was different from the silence of a battlefield. It wasn't oppressive. "You're always on duty, aren't you?" A voice broke through the quiet light yet commanding. Ethan turned sharply, his hand instinctively moving toward his holster. But as soon as his eyes fell on Princess Eudora, he relaxed. She stood beneath an arch of glowing vines, her silhouette bathed in their gentle light. Her gown, a cascading fabric that shimmered like liquid starlight, seemed to merge with the other world. "I wasn't aware anyone else would be in the garden." "Your Highness," Ethan said, his voice steady but respectful. "I could say the same about you, Captain," Eudora replied, stepping closer. Her gaze was sharp yet curious. "Shouldn't you be resting after today's performance?" Ethan smirked faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Rest is a luxury when threats still loom. I don't take chances, especially when it comes to your safety in the..." Eudora studied him for a moment, her head tilting slightly. "You're a curious man, Captain. You throw yourself into danger without hesitation, yet you stand here as though nothing weighs on you. Is there nothing that frightens you?" "Here's just another enemy," Ethan said after a pause. "You learn to manage it. Channel." "Manage it," Eudora repeated, almost to herself. Her gaze shifted to the glowing pond nearby, the ripples in the water reflecting her contemplative expression. "That sounds like a soldier's answer." "It's the only answer I know," Ethan admitted, his voice softening. He hadn't expected to have a conversation with a princess, let alone one that felt this candid. "And you, princess, do you manage your fears?" Eudora's violet eyes turned to him, glinting with a mix of humor and challenge. "What makes you think I have fears, Captain?" "Everyone does," he said simply. She didn't reply immediately. Instead, she began to walk, her steps graceful but unhurried. Ethan hesitated for a moment before falling into step beside her. The air between them was charged, though with what, he wasn't entirely sure. "Do you know what I fear the most?" she asked finally, her voice quieter now, almost lost in the hymn of the garden. "It's not the Theracans, though they're certainly dangerous. It's not even the politics of the court, though that's its own battlefield." She stopped and looked up at the moons. "What I fear most is failure, failing my people, my father, being remembered not for who I am, but for what I didn't accomplish." Ethan frowned, her words stirring something within him. "From where I stand, you don't seem like someone who'd fail at anything." Eudora laughed softly, though there was no mirth in it. "That's because you don't know me, Captain. Not really. You see a princess, a title, but there's more to me than that." Ethan hesitated before responding. "Then show me." The challenge in his words caught her off guard, and for a moment her composed mask slipped. She looked at him as if seeing him for the first time, as if trying to decide whether he meant what he said. After a beat, she smiled faintly, though it carried a weight he couldn't quite place. "You're bold, Captain. I can see why my father trusts you." Their walks in the garden became more frequent over the following days. At first, their conversations remained formal, centered on court matters and strategy, but gradually, they ventured into more personal territory. One night, as they stood on a bridge overlooking a cascading waterfall, Ethan spoke of Earth. He described the vast oceans, the sprawling cities, and the stars that look so much smaller from the planet's surface. "Your world sounds chaotic," Eudora said, leaning against the bridge's railing. "And yet beautiful." "It is," Ethan admitted, "but it's a different kind of beauty. Raw, untamed, nothing like this place." He gestured to the garden around them. "Your people have a way of making everything feel intentional." Eudora chuckled. "That's one way to put it. Sometimes, though, I envy the chaos you describe. There's freedom in it, isn't there?" Ethan thought about that for a moment. "Freedom, yes, but it comes at a cost. Nothing stays." She nodded, her gaze distant. "Perhaps that's why we need people like you, those who can bring order to the chaos." He glanced at her, noting the way the moonlight caught in her hair. "Or maybe it's the other way around. Maybe we need people like you to remind us that chaos isn't always something to fear." Their eyes met, and for a moment the world seemed too still. There was something unspoken between them, something neither was ready to name. Eudora looked away first, clearing her throat. "We should return," she said, her tone shifting back to one of propriety. "The night grows late." Ethan nodded, falling into step beside her as they made their way back toward the palace. Yet as they walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them, something that neither of them fully understood. That night, Ethan lay awake in his quarters, staring at the ceiling. He replayed their conversations in his mind, the way her voice softened when she spoke of her fears, the way her eyes seemed to hold galaxies within them. He'd come to this planet to protect its king, to do his duty as a soldier. But now, he found himself questioning whether duty was enough. Eudora, too, found sleep elusive. As she sat by her window, watching the moon's reflection on the distant lake, she thought of the human soldier who had so unexpectedly entered her life. He was unlike anyone she'd ever met, unshakable, yet vulnerable in ways he tried to hide. She wondered what his presence would mean for her kingdom. Neither of them could know how their fates were already entwining, like the glowing vines that wove through the palace gardens. Beneath the stars of Zarathea, something was beginning to bloom, a bond that would defy the boundaries of their worlds. The palace buzzed with energy. Courtiers moved swiftly through the halls, their elegant robes trailing behind them, their faces painted with curiosity and apprehension. The news of Captain Ethan Drake's AS's wish had spread like wildfire through the kingdom. Among the whispers of disbelief and speculation, the most persistent question lingered. Why had the human soldier, a stranger to their world, asked Princess Eudora hand in marriage? The prophecy was ironclad, its laws as ancient as the kingdom itself. Whoever saved the life of the ruling monarch was entitled to one wish, a binding promise that not even King Zarathan could deny. Ethan's wish had shocked the court, but none more so than Princess Eudora. She had barely slept since the day Ethan spoke those fateful words. Her chambers, usually a sanctuary of peace, felt stifling. The delicate lattice windows offered a view of the twin moons, their light bathing the room in a calming glow. But even their beauty couldn't settle her mind. She paced the polished floors, her thoughts a whirlwind. The morning of the wedding dawned with a golden hue, the twin suns casting their light over Lunathan. The palace was transformed into a spectacle of grandeur, adorned with ribbons of bioluminescent silk that pulsed softly, as if alive. Flowers native to Zarathia, their petals glowing faintly, lined every hallway. The main atrium, where the ceremony would take place, was a masterpiece of alien architecture. The crystalline dome overhead refracted the sunlight, casting a kaleidoscope of colors onto the marble floor. Ethan stood before a wide mirror in a private chamber, adjusting the ceremonial armor that had been provided to him. Unlike his battle gear, this armor was purely decorative, its design intricate and alien. The polished metal shimmered in hues of silver and violet, and though it fit perfectly, it felt heavy on his shoulders. He wasn't used to such finery. He preferred the practicality of his combat suit. His reflection stared back at him, the lines on his face deeper than he remembered. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. He'd faced death countless times, but this moment felt different. This wasn't a battlefield he could navigate with. The stakes were personal, and that unnerved him. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Ethan turned to find Zara standing in the doorway, his presence commanding as always. "Your Majesty," Ethan said, bowing slightly. Zarathan entered the room, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he said nothing, simply studying the man who had not only saved his life, but dared to request the hand of his daughter. "Do you understand the weight of what you've asked for, Captain?" "I do," Ethan replied, meeting the king's gaze. "But I also know what I feel. I care for her." The king's eyes narrowed, glowing faintly with an intensity that was almost intimidating. "Eudora is not just my daughter. She is a symbol of this kingdom's strength and wisdom. By marrying her, you are tying your fate to ours. Are you prepared?" Ethan nodded, his voice steady. "I've faced challenges my entire life, Your Majesty. This will be no different. I'll protect her and this kingdom with everything I have." Zarathan's stern expression softened slightly, though his voice remained firm. "Words are easy, Captain. Prove them with your actions." He turned to leave but paused at the door. "For her sake, I hope you are as steadfast as you appear." The ceremony was a spectacle of unity, blending human and alien traditions. Eudora entered the atrium, her gown a marvel of Zarathian craftsmanship. The fabric shimmered like liquid light, shifting colors with her movements. Her hair was adorned with delicate threads of glowing silver, and a diadem rested on her brow, a symbol of her royal lineage. Ethan watched her approach, his breath catching. She was stunning, but it wasn't just her beauty that struck him. It was her strength, the way she carried herself with quiet confidence despite the circumstances. He knew this marriage wasn't what she had envisioned for herself, and yet she stood there, unwavering. The officiant, an elder with skin that shimmered like opal, began the ceremony. The words were spoken in an ancient Zarathian dialect, a language Ethan didn't fully understand but found himself captivated by. The court watched in silence, their expressions a mixture of awe and skepticism. When it came time for their vows, Ethan spoke with sincerity. "I may not come from your world," he said, his voice steady, "but I vow to honor and protect you, Princess Eudora, not just because of duty, but because of what I've come to feel for you." Eudora's gaze met his, her expression unreadable. She hesitated for a brief moment before speaking her own vows. "Captain Ethan Drake," she began, her voice clear and composed, I accept this union not because it was demanded by prophecy, but because I see in you a man of honor. I vow to stand beside you as a partner and as a guardian of this kingdom." The room erupted in applause as the ceremony concluded, but amidst the noise, Ethan and Eudora shared a quiet moment. For the first time, she offered him a small, genuine smile, and he felt a flicker of hope that perhaps this union could be more than mere obligation. The wedding feast that followed was a dazzling affair. Alien delicacies were served on plates of crystal, their colors as vibrant as their flavors were exotic. Musicians played hauntingly beautiful melodies on instruments that emitted light as they were. Ethan and Eudora sat side by side at the head table, their every move scrutinized by the court. Despite the festive atmosphere, Ethan couldn't ignore the whispers that floated through the room. "A human soldier marrying our princess. It's unthinkable. Do you think he has ulterior motives? Perhaps he aims to secure power. He saved the king's life. The prophecy binds us, but still." Eudora leaned toward him, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "You'll have to get used to that. The court thrives on gossip." Ethan smirked faintly. "Let them talk. I'm here for you, not them." Her eyes flickered with something he couldn't quite place. Gratitude, amusement, whatever it was, it gave him a small sense of victory. As the evening wore on, Ethan found himself stepping onto one of the palace balconies, seeking a moment of quiet. The twin moons hung low on the horizon, their light bathing the city in a soft glow. He leaned against the railing, his thoughts heavy. "I thought soldiers didn't retreat." Eudora's voice came from behind him. He turned to see her standing there, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Just needed some air," he said. "Big day." She joined him at the railing, her gaze on the city below. "It was unexpected what you said during the ceremony. About your feelings." Ethan hesitated. "I meant it." "I know," she said, her voice softer now. "That's what makes it unexpected." They stood in silence for a moment, the tension between them easing slightly. For the first time, it felt as though they were truly alone, without the weight of the court or the prophecy pressing down on them. "Do you regret it?" she asked suddenly, her eyes searching his. "Not for a second," he said, his voice steady. "Do you?" She didn't answer right away, her gaze turning back to the city. Finally, she shook her head. "Not." Ethan chuckled softly, and for the first time that day, he allowed himself to relax. Beneath the light of the twin moons, something fragile yet undeniable began to take root between them, a tentative trust, a shared hope that perhaps this union could become something neither of them had expected. The weeks following the wedding were a blur of ceremonies, diplomatic receptions, and whispered intrigues. For Princess Eudora and Captain Ethan Drake, life as newlyweds was a delicate balancing act. Their union was watched by the entire kingdom, scrutinized for any sign of weakness or failure. What had started as a bond forged by prophecy and duty was slowly evolving into something more, but not without its challenges. One crisp morning, Eudora stood in her private chamber, her reflection staring back at her from the full-length mirror. Her luminous gown, a soft blue that shifted to silver in the light, fit snugly against her figure. But something was different now, a faint change she could feel more than see. Her physician had confirmed it that morning. She was pregnant. The weight of the revelation settled heavily on her shoulders. It wasn't fear she felt, at least not entirely, but a deep sense of responsibility. Her child would be a hybrid, a symbol of unity between humans and Zarathian. That symbolism was as much a burden as it was a hope for the future. She ran her hand over her abdomen, still flat and unassuming, as if trying to imagine the life growing within her. A knock at the door drew her attention. "Come in," she called, her voice steady despite the swirl of emotions inside her. Ethan stepped into the room, his ceremonial armor glinting faintly in the morning light. He had been summoned to a council meeting earlier, but he looked as though he hadn't heard a word of it. His gaze softened when it landed on her. "You look worried," he said, stepping closer. "I am," Eudora replied, turning to face him. "But it's not about politics, it's—" His brow furrowed, concern flickering across his face. "What is it?" She hesitated, searching for the right words. Then, taking a deep breath, she said, "I'm pregnant." Ethan froze, the weight of her words sinking in. His expression was a mixture of surprise, joy, and something else she couldn't quite place. Perhaps a hint of fear. Slowly, a smile spread across his face. "We're having a child?" he asked, his voice soft. Eudora nodded, her lips curving into a small smile despite herself. "Yes, but this isn't just about us, Ethan. This child, they'll be more than just our child. They'll be the kingdom's symbol of unity. The court will see them as a threat or a promise, and that puts us all in danger." Ethan stepped closer, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. "Then we'll protect them, no matter what." His words, so simple yet resolute, gave her a measure of comfort. But even as she leaned into his strength, a shadow lingered at the edge of her thoughts. The news of Eudora's pregnancy spread quickly through the palace. It was announced during a grand banquet where King Zarathan, his face glowing with pride, raised a glass to toast the future of the kingdom. The court erupted into cheers and applause, though not everyone shared in the joy. Prince Kyle, Eudora's younger brother, sat near the end of the banquet table, his expression carefully neutral. His golden eyes, a sharper hue than Eudora's, flickered with something darker as he watched the celebration unfold. Kyle had always been a picture of princely charm in public, but beneath the polished exterior lay a deep-seated ambition. For years, Kyle had assumed he would ascend the throne. As the only son of King Zarathan, it was his birthright, or so he believed. But the arrival of Ethan, a human soldier, had disrupted everything. And now, with a child on the way, Kyle's path to the throne was slipping further out of reach. In the shadowed corridors of the palace, Kyle met with a trusted confidant, Malrek, a former soldier who had been quietly dismissed from the royal guard years ago for his ruthless tendencies. Malrek now served as Kyle's right hand in matters the prince couldn't afford to be linked to direct. "The child must not be born," Kyle said, his voice low but firm. Malrek's lips twisted into a sly grin. "That can be arranged, my prince. A slip of poison, perhaps, or an accident in the palace garden." Kyle's jaw tightened, his golden eyes narrowing. "No, it must be subtle. If anyone suspects me, it will be the end of everything." "Fine." Malrek nodded, his grin fading as he slipped into the shadows. "As you wish." Ethan had grown increasingly wary in recent days. His instincts, honed by years of combat, told him something was amiss. The palace seemed quieter than usual, the servants more hesitant, the guards more distracted. Whispers followed him wherever he went, and though the court had always been a place of gossip, this felt different. One evening, as Ethan returned from a training session with the palace guards, he found Eudora sitting by the window in their chambers. Her expression was distant, her hand resting protectively on her abdomen. "Something's wrong," Ethan said, removing his gloves and setting them on the table. "I can feel it." Eudora looked up at him, her violet eyes troubled. "You're not the only one. I've noticed the way Kale looks at me, at us." There's resentment in his eye. Ethan's jaw tightened. "You think he's a threat?" Eudora hesitated, then nodded. "I don't want to believe it, but Kyle has always been ambitious. He may see our child as a challenge to his claim to the throne." Ethan crossed the room in a few strides, his hands resting on her shoulders. "If Kale is plotting something, we'll stop him. I'll make sure of it." It wasn't long before Ethan's suspicions were confirmed. Late one night, as the palace lay in silence, a shadow slipped through the halls toward Eudora's chambers. The figure moved with practiced stealth, carrying a vial of liquid that shimmered faintly in the moonlight. Ethan, who had taken to patrolling the halls near Eudora's room, caught the movement out of the corner of his eye. He followed silently, his pulse rifle at the ready. The figure stopped just outside Eudora's door, uncorking the vial and preparing to pour its contents into the goblet of water left for her each night. Before the figure could move, Ethan struck. His hand clamped down on the intruder's wrist, wrenching the vial away. In one swift motion, he slammed the figure against the wall, the shadows falling away to reveal Malrek's twisted grin. "Who sent you?" Ethan growled, his voice low and dangerous. Malrek sneered, blood dripping from the corner of his mouth. "You'll never stop it, soldier. The prince will." Ethan silenced him with a sharp blow to the head, rendering him unconscious. The palace guards arrived moments later, summoned by the commotion. Ethan handed Malrek over to them, his mind racing. He returned to Eudora's chambers, where she waited anxiously. When he told her what had happened, her face paled, but her resolve hardened. "We can't let this go unanswered," she said, her voice firm. "Kyle must be confronted." Ethan nodded, "And he will be. But we need proof enough to ensure he can't deny it." The events of that night marked a turning point. Ethan and Eudora, once united by circumstance, now stood as partners in a battle that went beyond the prophecy. Together, they began to uncover the full scope of Kyle's treachery, setting the stage for a confrontation that would test their courage, their love, and their resolve to protect the life they were building together. The palace was a hive of activity as dawn broke over Lunathan. News of the assassination attempt on Princess Eudora had spread, sending shockwaves through the court. Servants whispered in corners. Guards doubled their patrols, and nobles gathered in hushed groups, speculating about who could have orchestrated such a bold and treacherous act. In the heart of the commotion stood Captain Ethan Drake, his expression carved from stone. He stood guard outside the council chamber, where King Zarathan and his advisors debated the ramifications of the attempt. The unconscious would-be assassin, Malrek, was being held in a secure cell, awaiting interrogation. Ethan's hand rested on the hilt of his blade, a weapon he rarely used but now found himself gripping tightly. His instincts were ablaze. He had fought countless battles in his time, but palace intrigue was a different battlefield altogether. A battlefield of whispers and shadows, where trust was a fragile thing. Inside the chamber, Eudora sat beside her father, her posture straight and regal despite the turmoil swirling around her. Her violet eyes scanned the faces of the assembled advisors, gauging their reactions as her father spoke. "This is not merely an attack on my family," Zarathan said, his voice steady but tinged with a rare anger. "This is an attack on the stability of our kingdom. If trust within these walls is compromised, we are weakened." An advisor, his robe glinting with the golden insignia of the royal council, stood. "Your Majesty, the evidence points to a conspiracy. The question is, who among us would dare to strike against the princess?" Eudora's voice cut through the murmurs that followed. "The question is not who would dare, it is who stands to gain." Her gaze was sharp, her tone commanding, and I believe we already know the answer. The chamber fell silent as the weight of her words settled over the room. Zarathan looked at her, his expression grave. "You speak of your brother." "I do," she replied without hesitation. "Kyle has always been ambitious. He sees my child as a threat to his claim to the throne. This attempt was not an act of desperation. It was calculated." Later that day, Ethan and a group of royal guards entered Malrek's cell. The former soldier sat chained to a heavy chair, his lips split and his eyes defiant. The dim light cast harsh shadows on his scarred face, making him look more animal than. Ethan crouched in front of him, his voice low and dangerous. "You're going to tell me everything, or you're going to regret crossing me." Malrek sneered, his bravado unshaken. "Do your worst, soldier. You think I fear you?" Ethan leaned closer, his eyes like ice. "You should." The interrogation was methodical. Malrek resisted at first, but Ethan's unyielding presence and sharp questions began to chip away at his defenses. Finally, after hours of relentless pressure, the dam broke. "It was the prince," Malrek spat, his voice hoarse. "Kyle hired me. He said the child would ruin everything, that the kingdom didn't need a half-breed heir." Ethan's jaw tightened, his fists clenching. "And how many others are involved?" "Just me," Malrek said with a bitter laugh. He didn't want anyone else knowing. Said it had to be clean. Ethan stood, his blood simmering. He turned to the guards. "Take him to the council chamber. The king needs to hear this." Kale was summoned to the council chamber, his expression a mask of calm. He entered the room with his usual confidence, his golden eyes scanning the faces of the counselors. When they landed on Ethan and Eudora, a flicker of unease crossed his face, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Father," Kyle said, bowing deeply to King Zarathan, "you summoned me?" "I did," Zarathan replied, his voice heavy with disappointment. Kyle, there has been an accusation made against you. Mulric, the man who attempted to poison your sister, claims you were behind the plot. Kale's face darkened, his expression shifting to one of indignation. That's preposterous. A convicted criminal accuses me, and you take his word for it. We take his confession, coupled with evidence, very seriously, Eudora said, her tone razor-sharp. The vial he carried was traced back to the palace stores only accessible to members of the royal family. Kale's composure cracked for a moment, his lips pressing into a thin line. Eudora, you know as well as I do that this kingdom cannot afford weakness. Stop, Zarathan interrupted, his voice a thunderclap that silenced the room. He rose to his full height, his glowing eyes fixed on Kyle. Do not speak of my grandchild in that way. Kale turned to his father, his mask of confidence replaced by desperation. Father, you know what this means. A hybrid heir will destabilize the court. The nobles will revolt. Zarathan's expression softened, though his disappointment remained. Kyle, I raised you to protect this kingdom, not to tear it apart. Your ambition has blinded you to your duty. Eudora stepped forward, her gaze piercing. You betrayed our family. You tried to take my child's life before they've even drawn their first breath. That is unforgivable. Kale's shoulders slumped, the weight of his actions finally catching up to him. He looked at his father, then at Eudora, and finally at Ethan. There was no hatred in his eyes now, only regret. The council debated Kyle's fate late into the night. Some argued for execution, citing the severity of his crime. Others, including Eudora, believed exile was a more fitting punishment, one that would allow him to live with the consequences of it. In the end, Zarathan made the final decision. The next morning, the sentence was announced. Prince Kyle is hereby stripped of his title and exiled from the kingdom of Lunathan, Zarathan declared. He will live the rest of his days far from the court he sought to undermine. Kale stood silently as the judgment was read. He didn't fight, didn't plead. As the guards led him away, he cast one final glance at Eudora. She held his gaze, her expression a mixture of sorrow and resolve. The kingdom was quiet in the days that followed. The court resumed its normal rhythm, but the atmosphere was different, heavier. Kyle's betrayal had left a scar not just on the royal family, but on the entire kingdom. Ethan and Eudora found solace in each other. Their bond, once tenuous, had strengthened through the ordeal. Together, they worked to rebuild trust in the court and prepare for the arrival of their child. One evening, as they stood on the balcony of their chambers, Eudora leaned against Ethan's shoulder, her hand resting on her growing abdomen. "Do you think he'll ever forgive himself?" she asked softly. Ethan wrapped an arm around her, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I don't know, but I do know this. Our child will grow up in a kingdom stronger for what we've been through." Eudora smiled faintly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, and with parents who will protect them no matter what. As the twin moons rose over Lunathan, their light washing over the city, Ethan and Eudora stood together, a united front against whatever challenges lay ahead. The twin moons of Zarathia hung low in the lavender sky, their silvery light reflecting off the crystalline spires of Lunathan. The city was unusually quiet, as though the entire kingdom held its breath, awaiting the moment that would change its future. In the royal palace, a soft cry echoed through the halls, a sound so small yet so powerful it rippled outward like a wave. Princess Eudora lay on a bed of woven starlight threads, her face pale but glowing with an inner radiance. Her hand clasped Ethan Drake's, his grip firm and steady despite the tremble in his fingers. A midwife, an elderly Zarathian woman with shimmering opalescent skin, cradled the newborn in her arms, her smile warm as she turned to the exhausted princess. "It is done, Your Highness," the midwife said softly. "You have brought life into the world." The child let out another wail, his voice strong for one so small. Ethan stepped closer, his eyes wide with wonder as the midwife placed the baby in Eudora's arms. The child was unlike anything either of them had imagined, a perfect fusion of human and Zarathian traits. His skin held a faint iridescence, and his eyes, though not yet fully opened, gleamed with a hint of violet, like his mother's. Eudora gazed down at her son, tears pooling in her eyes. She reached out a trembling hand to brush his cheek, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's beautiful." Ethan knelt beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder as he looked at their child. He had faced battles, defied death, and uncovered conspiracies, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. "He's perfect," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. The midwife stepped back, giving the new parents their space. Around them, a handful of royal advisors and guards stood silently, their faces softening as they beheld the scene. Even the most skeptical among them could not deny the significance of the moment. The first hybrid heir to the Zarathian throne, born of two worlds once divided. 3 days later, the palace atrium was transformed for the naming ceremony, an ancient Zarathian tradition meant to honor the arrival of new life. Streams of glowing silk hung from the crystalline dome overhead, and the room was filled with the hum of a ceremonial hymn sung by a choir of Zarathian priests. The child's name, a closely guarded secret, would be revealed before the... Ethan stood beside Eudora, his ceremonial armor polished to a high sheen. Despite the formal setting, he couldn't help but glance down at his son, who rested in Eudora's arms. The baby's small hands waved in the air, his curious eyes wide and bright, as though taking in the grandeur around him. King Zarathan stepped forward, his presence commanding yet gentle. His voice carried through the atrium with ease. "Today, we celebrate not only the birth of my grandson, but the beginning of a new chapter for our kingdom, a chapter of unity, of hope." The crowd, a mix of nobles, advisors, and citizens, watched in silence as the king turned to Eudora and Ethan. "Have you chosen a name for this child, who represents the bond between two worlds?" Eudora nodded, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "We have, father." She looked to Ethan, who nodded for her to continue. Turning back to the crowd, Eudora spoke with clear, deliberate words. "His name is Kalian Zarath Drake. Kalian, to honor the strength of my family's legacy, and Zarath, to carry forward the wisdom of our ancestors." The name echoed through the atrium, a murmur rising among the crowd. It was a bold choice, tying the child's name to the very essence of Zarathia's history. The murmurs quickly turned to applause, a ripple that grew into a thunderous ovation. Ethan looked at Eudora, his chest swelling with pride. "Kalian," he repeated quietly, the name rolling off his tongue like a promise. "It's..." In the weeks that followed, life in the palace settled into a new rhythm. Ethan and Eudora took turns caring for Kalian, learning together what it meant to be parents. The baby's cries were now a familiar sound in the halls, a reminder of the fragile life they had sworn to protect. But not all was peaceful. The kingdom's nobles, though publicly supportive, were divided in their opinions of the hybrid heir. Some saw Kalian as a symbol of hope, a bridge between human and Zarathian cultures. Others viewed him as a threat, a deviation from tradition that could destabilize the throne. Ethan's military instincts kept him alert. He began to notice subtle changes in the palace. Guards stationed in unusual places whispered conversations that ceased when he entered a room. He shared his concerns with Eudora one night as they sat by the fireplace in their chambers. "There are still those who would see us fail," Ethan said, his voice low. "They're watching, waiting for a chance to strike." Eudora nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Then we must show them we are stronger together. Kalian's birth isn't just a change for us. It's a challenge to them, and challenges must be met with resolve." Her words bolstered Ethan's determination. Together, they began working closely with the king to address the concerns of the court, hosting meetings and forging alliances with key nobles. Ethan's straightforward, military approach balanced Eudora's diplomatic finesse, and together, they began to sway even the most skeptical voices. As Kalian grew, his unique heritage became more evident. By the age of 6 months, his skin glowed faintly under the twin moons, and his laughter held a melodic quality that seemed to soothe those who heard it. Advisors often remarked that the child had an aura about him, a presence that felt far greater than his small form. One evening, as the family sat in the garden beneath the glowing vines, Ethan held Kalian in his arms, while Eudora watched with a serene smile. The boy reached for the stars, his tiny hands grasping at the air as though he could pluck them from the sky. "He'll be a great leader one day," Eudora said softly, her voice filled with quiet certainty. Ethan looked at her, then down at their son. "He'll be better than great. He'll be what this kingdom needs." Eudora leaned her head against Ethan's shoulder, her hand resting on his. In that moment, they felt not just like a family, but like the beginning of a legacy, a union that had weathered trials and emerged stronger. As the years passed, Caelian became a symbol of unity across Zarathia. His presence inspired hope in those who had doubted, and his parents' dedication to the kingdom proved that love and duty could coexist. The court began to shift, its walls no longer echoing with division, but with cautious optimism. Ethan, once an outsider, became a respected figure in the kingdom. His military expertise and unwavering loyalty earned him a place not just at the king's side but in the hearts of the people. Eudora, always graceful and composed, grew into a role that balanced queenly wisdom with motherly warmth. In the final scene of their journey, the family stood atop the highest spire of Lunathan, overlooking the city as the twin suns set on the horizon. Caelian, now a young boy, clung to Ethan's hand as Eudora stood beside them. "This is our future," Eudora said, her voice carrying the weight of both pride and hope. "And it's brighter than ever," Ethan replied. As the first stars appeared in the evening sky, the three of them stood together, a family that had defied the odds, their love and strength bridging the divide between worlds. Theirs was a story not just of survival but of triumph, a testament to the power of unity in a universe often torn apart by differences.